Thank you, Chair, and thank you, because I'm not a member, so I appreciate getting the chance. I was listening to you from Mullingar, so some of my questions will relate to some of the issues that were raised earlier. First of all, Professor, thank you, by the way, for your time and your expertise. Professor McMullen, you said the temperature limit is the overriding goal. And I just want to ask you, but that's not exactly what we're measuring specifically. And I suppose my question is, why do you think that the European Commission isn't actively looking towards the most accurate, the most up-to-date, scientifically based warming measurements? And I suppose I'm asking you a political question in this sense, that Ireland's system is quite different to many other European countries, our grass-based system. And my instinct is, if this was the system, let's say in France or Poland, that the Commission would be much quicker to look at the more up-to-date science for measuring. So you don't have to answer that, but if you could, I'd appreciate it. Secondly, Professor Thorne, you made a really important point. You said that you despair that agriculture is being disproportionately blamed. And I listened earlier to the colleague from California who said that most of the methane produced here is enteric. So therefore, that gives us really good opportunities to try to minimise it, to decrease it, much more so than they have there. And they have managed to decrease it by 30%, because he said that food additives, etc., would make a huge difference. And I think what struck me most was he said that the state engages with farmers. They work with farmers to find market solutions. And we don't seem to be doing that here. There seems to be a lot of finger pointing, but not speaking to farmers, looking at the actual situation and saying, how can we improve this? My next question is, and I've listened carefully about the two different types of methane, biogenic and fossil. And obviously it seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, that time frame is what's crucial here, that we've behaved very badly up to now. So the methane that we are producing now, because we're at the level we're at, is in a way much more dangerous, because it will take the 24 years for the half-life for that to begin to convert to CO2. So just a comment on that. I'm nearly finished. If you said, if we cut CH4 by 3% per decade, there will be no additional warming impact. If we were to cut it by the 30% that they have managed in California with their dairy herd, can you give us an estimate of the decrease in global temperatures? And can you give us a time frame for that? And finally, the issue of carbon leakage. And I have to say on this issue, Professor McMullen, I disagree with you. You said that our ability to influence bigger countries depends on our good behaviour. Well, I spent 15 years in the European Parliament and had some, if you like, I was watching and participating in some of the debates on trade deals. And to me, the only thing that matters is proper scientific measurement, rules and regulations that can be enforced. Good behaviour counts for virtually nothing. And that's my view on that.
Okay, no more points there. We could have brief answers, please, because I'm under pressure. Thank you. Professor McMullen.
Well, thank you, Deputy Harkin, and I defer to your expertise on the political difficulties, absolutely. In terms of the changes to EU, potential changes to EU accounting, as you very well know, changes to governance at EU level is very difficult to bring about. It's a very slow process. It unfolds very slowly. But I completely agree with you that there would be good arguments for for Ireland to use its influence in the EU to augment accounting in the manner that Professor Allen explained in an earlier session, to augment the accounting to better reflect the contribution to warming of different gases, and I think that would be very beneficial. The EU policy in Ireland could certainly take a lead on that. In terms of that question of international influence, I agree to an extent. Absolutely, what works, particularly in the trade situation, is rules and standards and scientific measurements. But in order to bring those forward and get other countries to buy into them, they're going to ask, well, why are you bringing forward those rules, or why are you bringing forward that change? And they're going to say, why should we, we'll give the argument in terms of the climate impact, and they'll say, well, hang on a second, that's going to affect us in this way, it's going to affect you in that way. Why should we go along with that? Why should we agree with that as part of this collective effort if you're not playing your proportionate part in that collective effort? And that's the point I was making, that in terms of leakage at the moment, if anything, we're on the wrong side of that equation because we're not playing our proportionate part. The fossil versus biogenic methane timescale question is a complicated question. The only answer I can give you, unfortunately, is that to do it properly, you actually have to feed trajectories of all the different gases into a form of model. The GWP star methodology that Professor Allen has explained is effectively a very simplified model for assessing the impact. But one way or another, you have to feed the disaggregated gases into a model and look at scenarios for different combinations of the gases and see what the aggregate temperature contribution would be. And that's the only way to get a good answer. But in the submission that I made, you'll see linked a paper we presented just last month at an international conference in Gothenburg, in which we did exactly this in the Irish context and looked at the trade-off using exactly the methodology explained by Professor Allen between Irish methane reductions in Irish methane flow and doing more or less than that, and the consequence for having to do more or less carbon dioxide removals.
Professor Harkin has a comment.
Okay, I'll try and be quick. So firstly, just to give an idea of timescales of international processes, they've just this last year, I believe, adopted the GWP 100 numbers from the IPCC AR5, despite AR6 coming out in the past year. So I don't expect things to change very quickly at international or EU reporting level, sort of fundamental level. In terms of your questions, or your question on calculations of those, any individual cow has an absolutely negligible thing, or even the cow, the herd of a single farm. It's when you aggregate that you have the effect. But there is a difference, as we've repeatedly stated, between fossil methane and biogenic methane, because the biogenic methane is picking up the carbon from the active component of the carbon cycle, so it does no very long-term harm. It does harm relative to not having that emission for the time frame that the methane is in the atmosphere, but it does no additional harm afterwards. A fossil methane does harm. And then on your question of farmers, we need to get away from them and us and finger pointing. Absolutely. I don't believe for a moment that the agricultural community is deliberately trying to do harm to the environment. Why would they? They rely upon the environment for their job. They're not wanting to leave their farms in a worse state. And it's not all down to methane emissions. The vast bulk of the warming to date is down to burning and extraction of fossil fuels. And that is doing harm, and that is why we need to look at all sectors, and everybody needs to play their part. And I'll come back to my opening remark. The real risk is that we're making this, in Douglas Adams' context, somebody else's problem for 97% of the population who are not farmers. It is not somebody else's problem. It is all of our problems. We need fundamentally to get to net zero CO2. Otherwise, it's game over. We're not going to stop the warming at any warming level, unless and until we get to net zero CO2. So don't let a methane discussion disabuse you of the notion, or disabuse anyone watching this of the notion that we must reduce CO2 to net zero. That is the absolute imperative.
Okay, the last comment to Dr. O'Gelly.
Yeah, thank you. A very short comment on which metrics is being used to report emissions. I think it is important to highlight that under the UNFCCC, countries are actually mandated to report their individual emissions, which scientifically are the most accurate way to understand what the climate outcomes of these emissions are. So it's not that neither the EU or the UN would not want to know the climate outcomes. The information is readily available to do that. The question is how one sets targets, and whether those targets and the metrics in which those targets are set reflect the highest possible ambition, and that is basically a different discussion.